Imagine the most exclusive wellness address in Beverly Hills, a six-story building sheathed in pale travertine, set back from Wilshire behind a row of Italian cypresses, trimmed so perfectly they look sculpted. The lobby is pure white marble, calicatta floor to ceiling, with a single orchid arrangement changed every morning by a florist on retainer. There is no sign above the door. Clients know the address by referral only. The receptionist greets you by name before you reach the desk. Behind her, a corridor leads past consultation suites, where board-certified physicians in white coats discuss your cellular age, your telomere length, your biological future. The waiting list is 3 years long. The founder has been profiled in 4 glossy wellness magazines. He has spoken at Davos, dined with 2 sitting governors, and donated the lead gift to a children's hospital wing that bears a name very close to his own. This is the Renewal Institute, and from the outside, it is the most legitimate address in regenerative medicine. But what if I told you that 2 levels below that marble lobby, behind a mirrored panel in the spa, a hidden elevator descended to a soundproofed basement where 94 young workers, recruited from abroad on fraudulent wellness research visas, were held as living plasma and tissue donors, cycling through extraction procedures on a rotating schedule, never permitted to leave? And what if I told you that the same building ran a private organ procurement line 1 floor deeper still, supplying harvested tissue to a brokerage network that crossed 4 continents, coordinated through an encrypted dark web portal under a codename its operators translated as The Garden? And what if I told you that the client ledger recovered from that server named 11 foreign oligarchs, 3 cartel financiers, and a cluster of American executives, each paying $400,000 per treatment cycle, some flying in on private charters, some sending personal physicians as proxies, and that the total revenue laundered through 7 shell wellness LLCs across 3 years exceeded $315 million. What you are about to witness is Operation Eternal Bloom. Today you will discover, step by step and uncensored, how the FBI stormed the Renewal Institute, rescued 94 survivors from a hidden sub-basement, seized evidence of one of the most sophisticated human exploitation schemes ever prosecuted on American soil, and began dismantling a global client network that Interpol is still hunting today. If you believe that billionaires who purchase youth with other people's blood belong in federal prison, you will want to see exactly how this one fell. The man at the center of all of it called himself Dr. Adrian Voss. The name was polished, the resume immaculate. Dual trained in internal medicine and cellular biology, fellowship at a prestigious European institute, board membership stacked like credentials on a wall. He moved to Los Angeles in his early 40s with a concept he packaged as precision longevity. The idea that biological aging was not inevitable but treatable, if you had access to the right biological material and the right physician to administer it. He was handsome in the way that inspires immediate trust, silver at the temples, unhurried voice, a habit of making eye contact that felt like being genuinely seen. His first clinic opened in a leased suite in Century City. Within 18 months, he had relocated to the Wilshire address, expanded to 6 full-time physicians, and begun cultivating a patient list that read like a Forbes subsection. His charity gala, the Voss Foundation Annual Longevity Dinner, raised $800,000 its first year for pediatric research. Photographs showed him laughing with senators, accepting a humanitarian award, cutting a ribbon outside the children's hospital wing his donation had funded. The wing was real. The donation was wired from one of his LLCs and partially recouped through a fraudulent research grant filing. But the ribbon was real, the cameras were there, and the image circulated widely. What the photographs never showed was what happened the morning after each gala, when Voss returned to the clinic and took the private elevator down. The infrastructure he built over 36 months was, in the language of the federal indictment, a criminal enterprise of remarkable architectural sophistication. 7 limited liability companies, each with a plausible name, 2 registered as medical research foundations, 1 as a wellness technology incubator, 1 as a real estate holding company for the Wilshire building, and 3 as offshore trusts routed through the Cayman Islands and a shell layer in Cyprus. The LLCs cross-billed one another constantly, consulting fees, licensing agreements, equipment leases, generating a paper trail so layered that 3 separate forensic accounting teams spent 14 months untangling it. The basement itself was constructed over 8 months during a permitted seismic retrofit of the building. Voss hired a private construction firm whose principal was a former contractor with ties to organized crime, paying entirely in wire transfers routed through the Cyprus shell. The sublevels were never disclosed to the city. The hidden elevator was installed behind a full-length mirror in the spa's private treatment corridor, operated by a biometric palm reader accessible only to Voss and his four most trusted lieutenants: a chief medical officer, a logistics coordinator, an intake administrator, and a security director who had previously worked private protection for a Gulf state family. Below ground, Level 1 held extraction suites, 12 clinical bays, each equipped for plasmapheresis and minor surgical procedures. Level 2, deeper still, held what investigators would later call the procurement ward, a space whose function does not bear prolonged description, except to say that its contents constituted the most serious criminal charges in the indictment. The donor population, 94 individuals at the time of the raid, had been recruited through a network of overseas labor brokers using promises of paid clinical research participation in the United States. Most held J-1 exchange visitor or fraudulent H-2B visas. Their passports were collected on arrival under the pretext of administrative processing. They were housed in the sub-basement, fed adequately to preserve health indicators, and cycled through extraction procedures on a schedule calibrated to maximize yield without triggering physiological collapse. The intake administrator maintained a database tracking each donor's biological markers, extraction history, and estimated remaining utilization period. Donors who fell below threshold were listed in the database with a code the prosecution would later read aloud in open court, and the courtroom went completely silent. The clients paid $400,000 per treatment cycle. The donors were paid nothing. If you think a plasma extraction line beneath a luxury clinic is the limit of what Adrian Voss built, the way the organ procurement network operated, and who was receiving those shipments on 3 separate continents, will leave you speechless. We will get to that in a moment. The thread that unraveled the entire operation was a single anomalous billing code. I spent time going through the case file, and one detail kept nagging at every investigator who saw it. A code labeled Autologous Transfusion Procedure, Donor Linked, filed against a Renewal Institute account in the 3rd quarter of the scheme's 2nd year. Autologous means the blood or plasma comes from the patient themselves, their own material, reinfused. The code was unremarkable. What was remarkable was the donor identification number attached to it. That number had been flagged 6 weeks earlier in the clinic's own internal records as deceased, a donor whose extraction history had been closed out and whose file bore a termination notation. The nurse who noticed it was a former intake coordinator named in court documents only as a federal cooperating witness. She had worked at the Renewal Institute's above-ground operation for 11 months, believing it to be a legitimate longevity practice. She had never been permitted access to the elevator behind the spa mirror. But she processed billing records, and she was precise, the kind of precise that comes from a decade of medical administration, from knowing that an autologous code attached to a deceased donor ID is not a clerical error. It is an impossibility. She did not go to the police immediately. She was afraid. She spent 2 weeks cross-referencing the code against every legitimate explanation she could construct, eliminating each one. Then she called her sister, who worked as a paralegal at a downtown Los Angeles firm. Her sister made a call, and 3 days later, the nurse was sitting across a desk from 2 FBI agents she had never met, in a federal building she had never entered, handing over a printed billing summary she had quietly saved to a personal drive the night before she resigned. Put yourself in her position for a moment. 11 months inside a building whose lower levels you never saw, holding a single anomalous code, knowing that making the call might end your career and that not making it might mean something far worse. She made the call. Everything that followed began there. The FBI's Los Angeles field office opened a preliminary inquiry within 72 hours of that first interview. The case was assigned to a composite lead agent, referred to in court documents as the special agent in charge of the task force, whose background combined financial crimes prosecution with human trafficking interdiction. From the start, the investigation was structured as a joint operation. FBI Criminal Investigative Division took the lead, with Homeland Security investigations running the visa fraud and human trafficking threads, DEA monitoring potential connections to cartel financiers on the client list, and Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network assigned to the money laundering architecture. The challenge in the early months was significant. Voss had no criminal record. His professional licenses were clean. The Renewal Institute had passed 3 state health department inspections, the task force would later establish, that were conducted only on the above-ground floors by inspectors who had no reason to suspect a concealed sublevel. The billing anomaly was real but thin. A single mismatched code, even an impossible one, does not support a federal warrant application for a building whose owner is a charity gala fixture with a named hospital wing. 3 months in, the investigation stalled. The task force had financial irregularities they couldn't yet explain, a cooperating witness whose testimony was credible but narrow, and a building they could not legally enter. The technical surveillance team proposed a Title III wiretap application on the clinic's administrative phone lines, but the probable cause threshold hadn't been met. The investigation nearly got shelved entirely when the cooperating witness's former colleague, a billing supervisor, who might have corroborated the anomalous code, abruptly resigned and left the country, almost certainly tipped off that someone was asking questions. The task force had 48 hours to decide whether to escalate or watch their cooperating witness become the only thread they had. The agent in charge escalated. Within a week, an undercover HSI operative with medical industry cover credentials submitted an application to the Renewal Institute's above-ground longevity program. The 3-year waitlist, it turned out, could be compressed considerably if the inquiry came with convincing financial documentation and a referral from one of the clinic's existing high-net-worth clients. A referral the task force obtained through a separate confidential informant already embedded in Voss's social network. The undercover operative spent 4 months as an above-ground patient at the Renewal Institute. She attended consultations, she received legitimate above-ground treatments, she built a relationship with the intake administrator over 12 carefully paced appointments. And on her 17th visit, she was offered, discreetly, with language so clinical it almost didn't register, the option to explore a deeper tier of cellular renewal, a private elevator, a consultation below. She declined that day, citing scheduling. She returned to the task force and spent 3 hours in debrief. That phrase, deeper tier, was the probable cause threshold they had been waiting for. What's most surprising about this case isn't the scale of the financial crime, it's that the entire operation nearly survived indefinitely because it was so precisely calibrated to the inspection patterns of every regulatory body that might have found it. Voss had studied the inspection cycles. He knew which agencies had jurisdiction over which floors. He had constructed the concealed levels during a permitted renovation window, under a contractor who would never talk. The cooperating witness's billing anomaly wasn't just a mistake, it was the only mistake in 36 months of meticulous operational security. One code. That was the entire gap. Before we get into the tactical details of the assault, a quick trivia question. Do you know which federal statute carries the highest mandatory minimum sentence for organ trafficking under U.S. law? And which agency has primary jurisdiction when trafficking intersects with international wire fraud? A. 18 U.S.C. 1591, primary jurisdiction FBI. B. 18 U.S.C. 13001, primary jurisdiction DEA. C. 21 U.S.C. 863, primary jurisdiction ATF. The answer will surprise you at the end of the video. Tactical planning for Operation Eternal Bloom began 6 weeks before execution. The challenge was layered. The target was a 6-story occupied building in a dense urban corridor, with legitimate above-ground patients and staff who would be present even at pre-dawn hours for early morning infusion appointments. The concealed sublevels were accessible only through a single biometric elevator, and the security director, a trained former protective detail operative, had installed a closed-circuit camera array covering every approach to the building's exterior, feeding to monitors in a security station at the basement level. A direct dynamic entry through the front doors would risk alerting the sub-basement before agents reached the elevator. The building's fiber optic communications infrastructure had to be severed simultaneously with the breach to prevent any remote alert reaching the dark web portal or the client network. 3 teams were assigned. Alpha, responsible for the above-ground floors and the administrative staff. Bravo, tasked with the hidden elevator, the sub-basement, and the extraction suites. Charlie, positioned at the residential address 9 kilometers away in Bel Air, where Voss was known to sleep on operational nights. 20 minutes before breach time, a final complication surfaced. The building's biometric elevator used a backup power cell independent of the main grid, meaning that cutting external power, the standard tactic for disabling electronic access controls, would not defeat the palm reader. The technical team had prepared for this. A portable electromagnetic pulse device, deployed against the elevator panel at close range, would force the cab to default to manual override, but it had to be deployed from inside the spa corridor, which meant Bravo team needed to pass through the above-ground spa floor before Alpha had fully cleared it. The solution was a 12-second compression of the Alpha timeline. The agent on point called the adjustment at 3:17 in the morning, standing in a tactical van on a side street 2 blocks from Wilshire. Everyone adapted in real time. Wednesday, 3:30 a.m. A column of vehicles, 3 vans carrying the livery of a downtown linen service company, 2 unmarked SUVs, and 1 Bearcat G3 armored vehicle, moved in coordinated silence along Wilshire Boulevard. A separate technical unit already in position at the street-level fiber junction box 1 block north cut the clinic's external communications at 3:29 exactly. Simultaneously, a drone jamming array mounted on the Bearcat activated, blanketing a 200-meter radius. Alpha team breached the main entrance at 3:30:07 using a hydraulic battering ram against the reinforced glass doors. FBI, everyone on the ground, hands visible, do not move. The overnight receptionist dropped immediately. 2 early morning clinical staff in the corridor froze, hands raised. Alpha cleared the above-ground floors in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Bravo team was already inside. They had entered through a service corridor at the building's east face, reached the spa level via a stairwell, and located the mirrored panel in 40 seconds. The undercover operative's detailed description had been precise to the centimeter. The electromagnetic device was deployed against the elevator panel at 3:31:22. The biometric reader flickered, reset to manual override, and the cab doors opened. FBI, do not move. Hands, now. The security director in the basement monitoring station spun from his screens and reached for a desk drawer. He did not reach it. He was on the floor in handcuffs in under 3 seconds. Bravo descended. Level 1, the extraction suites, 12 bays. The lead surgeon was present, an overnight monitoring shift. He stood from a workstation as the team entered, and the phrase he chose was remarkable for its precision. You have no jurisdiction over a private medical facility. The agent on point answered without breaking stride. We have a warrant signed by a federal judge, a Title III authorization, and about 94 reasons to be here. Step back. The surgeon complied. Level 2 required a titanium cutting torch. The door was reinforced beyond what the hydraulic ram could address. The task force had anticipated this, and the cutting team had pre-positioned on the descent. 4 minutes and 30 seconds to breach. When the door opened, the agents found what the warrant had described, and several things the warrant had not. The procurement ward was fully operational. It had been operational that night. 8 minutes and 44 seconds from first breach to full sub-basement control. What happened in the next hour in the basement of the Renewal Institute is the part of this story that stays with the agents who were there. 94 people. Most were young, late 20s, early 30s. Most were thin in the particular way that comes from controlled nutrition, calibrated to biological output rather than health. Most had identification documents stored somewhere above them in an administrative office, documents they had not held since arrival. Most spoke little or no English. Most had been inside that building for between 4 months and 2.5 years. The female agents on Bravo team removed their tactical helmets. Not on instruction, it was a decision made in the moment, individually, because entering a room full of terrified people in full tactical gear is not the same as clearing a room full of armed personnel, and the agents understood the difference. The HSI interpreter, a Spanish speaker, as the largest donor population had been recruited through networks in Central and South America, lowered her rifle to her side and began speaking. Calmly, slowly. Federal agents, you are free. No one will hurt you. We are taking you out of this building right now. Some of the 94 did not move. Some had been there long enough that the concept of the statement required time to resolve. The medics, a triage team staged in the building's courtyard garden behind the Bearcat, waited with blankets, water, basic trauma kits, and in 2 cases, pediatric comfort items for the youngest 2 survivors, both of whom were under 20. Ambulances were staged 2 blocks away to avoid initial scene chaos, called forward in sequence as triage assessments were completed. The last survivor to leave the sub-basement was a woman who had been inside for 31 months. An agent walked beside her the entire length of the corridor, through the elevator, up through the spa level, and out through the main doors into the early morning air. She stopped at the threshold. She stood there for a moment. Then she stepped outside. At the same moment Bravo team was descending to level 2, Charlie team was at the gate of a residential compound in Bel Air, a 7-bedroom property set behind a perimeter wall, with a monitored gate and a security detail of 2. The detail did not resist. They stepped aside when the warrant was presented, and the Bearcat pulled to the gate. Inside, Voss was located at the pool terrace, apparently awake, dressed, phone in hand. Whether he had received some signal before the communication cut is a question the investigation pursued extensively. No conclusive evidence of advance notice was established, but the prosecution noted in closing argument that a man who had never previously been poolside at 3:30 in the morning chose that particular morning to be there. "You have absolutely no jurisdiction over a private physician," he said, as the agents approached. He said it with a calm that several agents later described as the most unsettling thing about the entire operation. The agent leading Charlie team stopped 2 feet in front of him. "The Attorney General of the United States signed your warrant this evening, Dr. Voss. You are under federal arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy to commit organ procurement fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. Turn around." Voss looked at the pool for a moment. Then he turned around. The handcuffs closed at 3:44 a.m. "You're not a physician," the agent said quietly as she walked him toward the vehicle. "You're a serial predator with a medical degree." Voss said nothing further. Here is the part that still sits uncomfortably, even now. The regulatory framework that governs private medical facilities in California, and in most of the country, has almost no mechanism for inspecting concealed sublevels that were never disclosed on permitted construction filings. Voss exploited a gap that is structural, not accidental. The inspectors who cleared his above-ground floors were not negligent. They inspected everything they were legally authorized to inspect. What this case tells us about the system is that oversight for high-end private medicine was built for above-ground fraud. The moment someone went underground, literally, the architecture stopped at the elevator door. That gap still exists. The press conference was held the following morning on the steps of the Edward R. Roybal Federal Building in downtown Los Angeles. The special agent in charge stood at the microphone and read the arrest totals. 14 individuals in custody, including Voss, his chief medical officer, the logistics coordinator, the intake administrator, the security director, and 9 additional staff and financial associates identified through the task force's 14-month investigation. 94 survivors were receiving medical care at 4 separate Los Angeles area hospitals. $315 million in assets had been frozen pending forfeiture, including the Wilshire Building, the Bel Air residential compound, 3 additional properties in Miami and Aspen, and the full suite of Shell LLC accounts. The media response was immediate and global. The Renewal Institute's above-ground website was offline within 6 hours, taken down not by the FBI but by the hosting provider, acting unilaterally. Voss's charity foundation suspended operations the same morning. The children's hospital wing that bore his name quietly began an internal review of its naming rights agreement. The 11 oligarch clients identified on the encrypted server were not named publicly at the press conference. Interpol coordination was already underway. Several had left the country in the weeks prior, a timeline the prosecution would later argue was not coincidental. The dark web portal's server logs were partially recovered by NSA Cyber Forensics and handed to the Joint Task Force under a classified sharing agreement. The logs contained transaction records, communication threads, and what the indictment described as a scheduling and procurement request database of extraordinary specificity. Nobody who read that database in full was unchanged by it. A congressional oversight hearing was called within 3 weeks. The relevant statutes, 18 U.S.C. 1591 for sex and labor trafficking, extended by prosecutorial theory to cover the donor exploitation scheme, 18 U.S.C. 1956 for money laundering, and RICO predicate charges under 18 U.S.C. 1962 were cited in an indictment running to 214 pages. The trial of Adrian Voss and his co-defendants opened 14 months after the raid. The defense team, 4 attorneys from a prominent Los Angeles firm, constructed an argument on 3 pillars. The first, that the donor population had consented to participation in clinical research, and that any consent irregularities were the responsibility of the overseas recruitment network, not the clinic. The prosecution demolished this in 3 hours of testimony from the intake administrator, who had flipped and agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence, and who described the consent process with a specificity that left no interpretive space. The second pillar, that the medical procedures conducted on the lower levels constituted innovative therapeutic practice protected under existing clinical research exemptions. The prosecution's medical expert testified for 2 full days. The jury's faces during that testimony were, by multiple courtroom accounts, uniform. The third pillar, that the financial architecture was the work of Voss's business managers, not Voss himself. The forensic accounting team presented 740 exhibits. Unpopular opinion, and we will say it plainly, the regulatory failure that allowed the Renewal Institute to operate for 36 months is not solely on Adrian Voss. The inspection regime that cleared his above-ground floors 3 times without ever questioning the permitted construction filings, the visa system that processed 94 J1 applications attached to a single institutional sponsor without a follow-up welfare check. These are institutional failures. Voss deserves every year of what is coming to him. But he also exploited gaps that should have been closed before he found them. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. The judge, visibly unmoved by the defense's closing appeal to Voss's philanthropic record, imposed the sentence in a courtroom that was standing room only. 11 consecutive life terms, 1 for each count of aggravated human trafficking. Additional concurrent sentences totaling 217 years on the money laundering, fraud, and RICO charges. Federal supermax designation. No possibility of parole. The co-defendants received sentences ranging from 22 to 41 years, calibrated individually by the judge based on each defendant's role and degree of cooperation. The fact that these crimes were conducted beneath a veneer of medical legitimacy, the judge said, reading from prepared remarks, does not mitigate them. It compounds them. The Wilshire building was seized and auctioned under federal forfeiture proceedings. The proceeds, combined with the liquidated Shell LLC assets, the real estate in Miami and Aspen, and the recovered offshore trust funds, were directed into a survivor restitution trust administered by a federal court-appointed trustee. The trust provides lifetime medical care, mental health support, education funding, and relocation assistance for each of the 94 survivors. Several have testified publicly, in closed congressional sessions, about their experience. Their names remain protected. The sub-basement was sealed. Both levels were filled with industrial concrete, poured over a 2-week period under federal oversight. The building above was auctioned to a commercial real estate developer, who has announced plans to demolish and rebuild. Nothing of the original structure below the 3rd floor will remain. The encrypted dark web server is another matter entirely. The partial logs recovered by the NSA cyber team have been shared with law enforcement in 7 countries. Of the 11 oligarch clients identified, 4 remain at large. Their last known locations span 3 continents. Interpol has issued red notices. Asset freeze requests have been filed in 4 jurisdictions. Would you have noticed the signs before it was too late? 1 anomalous billing code, 1 nurse who was precise enough to recognize an impossibility and brave enough to report it. That was the entire fulcrum on which a 36-month criminal enterprise turned. Comment your answer. We read every one. Today, no one named in those server logs is sleeping soundly. Now, the answer to our trivia. The correct answer is A, 18 U.S.C. 1591, with primary jurisdiction held by the FBI in coordination with HSI when trafficking intersects with visa fraud and interstate commerce. The statute carries mandatory minimums that scale with the number of victims and the degree of force or coercion involved, which is precisely why the indictment structured its trafficking counts individually, 1 per identified donor. 94 counts. 94 mandatory terms. No marble lobby is deep enough, and no shell company layered enough to bury what American federal law will eventually find. The weight of justice does not lift. Stay alert. If you want to keep watching us pull the threads that the rich and powerful would rather you not see, subscribe to Hoover Files, and tell us in the comments which case you'd want us to break open next. We'll see you on the front lines of our next operation.